Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Iran and China signed a 25-year strategic cooperation pact on Saturday in the latest expansion of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Negotiations for the deal, launched 5 years ago, sparked controversy in Iran last year. Virtually no details of the deal's contents have been released so far, though it is said to be to the tune of $400 billion. China is Iran's leading trade partner and was one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil before the US President Donald Trump reimposed sweeping unilateral sanctions in 2018. Earlier, Trump had walked out of a multilateral nuclear agreement with Tehran. The China-Iran Pact, which Tehran said included political, strategic, and economic components, was signed by the two countries' foreign ministers Wang Yi and Mohammad Javad Zarif. We believe this document can be very effective in deepening Iran-China relations, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh said. He said the pact had first been proposed during a visit to Tehran by Chinese President Xi Jinping in January 2016. We'll get into the details during the discussion, but the development also has to be seen in the backdrop of rising Sino-US tensions. In a phone call to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, US President Joe Biden suggested that democratic countries should have an infrastructure plan to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative. The sparring match between top diplomats of China and US at Anchorage has already got much analytical traction. Down south, tension is brewing between the Philippines and China over some Chinese fishing vessels that Manila says are in its territorial waters. To discuss the US-Iran deal as well as the broader Sino-US relations, I'm joined by Mitter, Professor of the History of Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. Professor Mitter is one of the leading authorities on China and is the author of several award-winning books. And Tohid Asadi, researcher and PhD candidate of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Let me begin with Tohid Asadi here. Tohid Asadi, the deal, as I said, was controversial. It was actually criticized by former President Ahmadinejad, who said that it wasn't in the public domain at all. And as a matter of fact, Javad Zarif was heckled in Parliament at that time. So how do you look at it now? I mean, how will the government sell it to the opposition?
Well, I think at the first glance and from a bilateral perspective, the deal or the framework in better wording that has been signed between Iran and China clearly indicates the extent to which these two countries are important for each other. For Chinese part, I think there is now a clear perception of how influential and significant Iran is in the region and even beyond. And of course, we know that China needs a kind of steady, independent supplier of energy, and Iran could be a good choice for that. And from Iranian part, Tehran, under some tough sanctions by the Western camp, now needs to, let's say, improve its international relations. And with this pivot to Asia strategy that now has been seriously taken into consideration in Tehran, the country is going towards the trajectory of focusing more on its, let's say, Asian partners, including China and, of course, other countries. So in this context, I think, with respect to your question, I think there is an intentional strategic consensus to release not all parts of the deal for several reasons. First and foremost, it's not a deal in better wording. It's a frame of strategic partnership. So one could naturally expect some further framework, further agreements, further pacts to, let's say, be signed in the later years. And do not forget that it's going to be something in practice for 25 years. So a huge amount of trade relations and a huge amount of investment could be exchanged between the two countries. And now I think the public, at least in Iran, considering all the pressure that comes from the West and all the unilateral courses of action that comes from the West and all the lack of commitment that comes to the West, now I think there is this consensus not only among Iranian politicians, but also among Iranian public that the United States and its partners are not the countries to be trusted. And this could kind of, let's say, prepare the mentality for more switching to China. And do not, again, forget this very fact that this is an interest-oriented and by nature economic deal signed or framework signed between the two countries, and naturally the signatories of the pact are going to look for.
Okay, so Asadi, I get your point. But here's the thing, very quickly. One, the foreign minister said that there's nothing secret about this, and he's also promised that it will be publicly announced. But we're talking about, frankly, two countries which aren't particularly transparent when it comes to these dealings. So there is that issue. And secondly, does this also suggest that finally Iran has decided that it's not going to go back into JCPOA, or at least not with, or is not expecting another round of talks with the US with reference to JCPOA?
I think just pertaining to the last point, I think when it comes to JCPOA, it's not really sensible to associate the two issues together, because JCPOA has got its own calculations and Iran-China relations has got its own. Of course, they are interrelated in some perspectives, but all in all, I think, first of all, JCPOA is signed and sealed in 2015, and the country that unilaterally withdraw from the deal, as you mentioned, is the United States. So if there is a problem with that, I mean, if there is something wrong with JCPOA, it's not from Iranian side. So if Iran wants to revive it, the best scenario and the best, let's say, possible option is to open the diplomatic channels, which is currently Iran doing. Let's not forget that Iran provided the United States with 3 proposals between January and February in order to revive the deal. So that means Iran is seriously, let's say, committed to the deal and is hardly working on that in order for it to be revived. This is on one hand. And then on the other hand, as I told you before, a consequence of the deal and the failure of the Western part to implement it, let's say, persuaded Iran to think about options, more options, and China relations, Iran-China relations could be one of them. And at the same time, this has got a traditional historic basis. I mean, China-Iran relations is not something new. It's not something all of a sudden. It has got deep roots in history.
Iran has been relying on China and Russia. I agree with you, Asadi. It makes eminent sense from the Iranian perspective to try and get closer to China. And $400 billion, if that's actually the correct figure, is a huge sum. But thank you so much. That was Tohid speaking with us. Let me go straight to Professor Rana Mitter. Rana Mitter, I want you to put this in the broader perspective of what I said in my opening with reference to rising tensions in the Sino-US relations. I remember last time we spoke about this, I talked about what the structural realists say, and I know that you have a more nuanced, perspective on this. But give me a sense of how you look at this in terms both of Iran hedging its bets and also China extending, as part of the BRI, extending its reach into the Middle East.
Ejaz, I think that's absolutely right, that there are at least 2 ways that you have to understand this major change that's happening with the signing of this framework agreement. And by the way, your commentator Tohid was quite right to say this isn't a deal in and of itself. It's the beginnings of a deal. It'll be, many decades before it comes to fruition. And many of the figures about quite how much money is involved are projections. They're not yet cash in the bank. So we have to be wary of confusing the hype with the reality. But let's look at the 2 factors that I think are most relevant when understanding why this is a significant deal, and I think it is. The first factor is, of course, the changing nature of the Middle East. And the one word or one place name that we haven't mentioned yet in this conversation is Saudi Arabia. Now, if Iran is one of the two great power makers, power brokers in the Middle East, then Saudi Arabia is clearly the other. And one of the things that's been most notable is that the United States and its relationship with Saudi Arabia under the Trump administration changed profoundly. So that is one factor that I think has got Iran very nervous. Now, of course, for China, in a sense, this is not so relevant because they have actually a very strong relationship with the Saudis, but it's almost entirely based on oil. It's not a strategic relationship, but they will have noticed that the US is closer to bringing some of these pro-American players in the region together. So I think that factor will have been built into what Beijing is thinking here. But the second factor, and this is the thing that really, I think, has changed, even in the last few days, let alone weeks, is the continuing freeze in US-China relations and actually Western-China relations more broadly speaking. We've seen that with the range of sanctions that have been imposed, first of all, by actually a suite of Western actors, so not just the US, but the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada, against certain Chinese politicians, particularly those involved with the re-education camps, some would say concentration camps, being built in Xinjiang province in western China. But also beyond that, we see that sanctions have been slapped back in retaliation by the Chinese against politicians and others in the Western countries as well. So that relationship is clearly at the moment in a very, very fractious state. And I think we have to see the signing of this deal with Iran in that context. Let me say something quite clearly. I think that while the relationship between Iran and China is going to be, in some ways friendly and useful to both sides, I would not mistake this for some kind of great new ideological realignment. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that China was actually backing up UN sanctions against Iran in the United Nations. They and Russia have changed their tune in recent years, partly, as your Tohid said, because of the American tendency under Trump to move away from the JCPOA. But I think that we would be mistaken to regard that as being the beginning of some very warm new relationship between China and Iran. It will be correct, it will be friendly, it'll be useful to both sides strategically and in terms of issues such as oil and resources, but it is not, I think, the next great ideological realignment.
Right, that's very interesting. I'm also joined by Einar Tangen, who's a political and economic affairs commentator based in Beijing. But before I go to Mr. Tangen, let me ask Rana another question. Now, Rana, China-EU trade, China-EU trade is now, in terms of volume, more than the EU's trade with the United States. I also mentioned in my opening this phone call between Biden and the British Prime Minister in terms of trying to sort of get the democratic countries to have an infrastructure plan to rival China's BRI. How do you look at that? Because on the one hand, as you said, there have been sanctions from the UK, from certain other European Union countries. On the other hand, look at the trade volumes. So which way is this going to pan out?
It's worth keeping a variety of things briefly in mind, Ejaz. One is that trade will continue between these various entities because, China wants to export to the EU and the US and isn't going to stop doing that. There are a whole variety of areas, including areas of high-value technology, where actually the supply chains continue to be very, very dependent on each other. China is going for a new so-called dual circulation economic strategy, which will try and bring a lot of production back home. But even a lot of the top Chinese tech firms would say that it would take years, maybe even decades, to indigenize a great deal of what's needed from the outside world. So in that sense, I wouldn't expect to see that there's going to be a fundamental realignment of trade. But in terms of the networks, yes, I think it is the case that the Western countries are going to try and create more of a sense of making an offer to the global South. So they're going to look at countries like Pakistan, where you're sitting right now, and saying, look, we are going to try and provide alternatives when it comes to telecommunications or when it comes to resources, because, of course, one of the reasons that Pakistan has found China such a useful partner is that China can offer a whole variety of economic goods that the West simply isn't providing at the moment. But my final thought on this at the moment is that I think that we should not overestimate quite how coordinated the Belt and Road Initiative really is. In a sense, it's a series of different economic and political ventures, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that have been brought together under this one big brand name of BRI. And the brand name keeps changing. Most recently, we've heard about the Health Silk Road, which has to do with China sending out its vaccines, Sinopharm, Sinovac, and others, to a variety of countries in the Middle East, Latin America, South Asia, and elsewhere. But I think it's a mistake to regard this as being some huge, great project that's being coordinated by a small group of people in Beijing from some central headquarters. It's much more scattered than that. It's much less top-down than that. And although, of course, it's had successes, BRI has had failures as well, like any other economic project. So in that sense, I think it's important to take it seriously, but not turn it into some sort of huge conspiracy theory, because I don't think it is that.
Right. Now, let me pull in Ms. Tangen here. Ms. Tangen, I completely agree with what Professor Rana is saying with reference to BRI. But as you know, the U.S. has made a big deal of this. As a matter of fact, Joe Biden called Boris Johnson and said that, let's try and have something at our end, getting the democratic countries together. So there is a sense that perhaps in, helping other countries with investment and infrastructure is going to be a better way of, countering the Chinese influence. So within that backdrop, we were discussing the 25-year deal that Wang Yi and Jawad Zarif has signed in Tehran. So give me your, thoughts on what exactly is happening.
Well, for China, it's very good. What they've seen now is, despite my colleagues poo-pooing it, is they have a clear line. From Pakistan, they can get to Iran and through Iran to Turkey. So they now have an official backdoor to Europe, assuming that these projects go through. And that was very important to China, especially at this time when one of their main concerns is that they would be subject to some sort of naval blockade, unfriendly situation with the U.S. pulling in more forces on some pretext, whether it's to guard the South China Seas or Taiwan, etc. For Iran, I think it's a major shift. This is a geopolitical. It's not ideological. I don't see any similarities between them, and I don't see there to be alliances. But China is not an ideological mover. What they want to do is have geographical connections that allow them to have this backdoor. But this really signals that Iran is turning its back on what used to be a very important market, the West, and largely putting its at least a good percentage of its eggs in the Eastern basket. And that makes sense. I mean, if you start looking at the wealth lines, if you start looking at the markets, the production, the use of oil, it's all going towards Asia right now. And that's not going to change anytime soon. So I think it's a marriage of geographical convenience, also politically, given that both feel hard used by the United States. And that particular thing will continue. And that's kind of what holds them together, as well as Russia. The U.S. had embarked on this idea that it was going to be America first and everything was going to kind of roll its way and that the hegemony would be maintained. But now you've seen that actually a lot of the dominoes they've set in motion have come back to kind of hit them in the backside.
Right. It's interesting that you talk about the naval blockade. Well, it can be any of the many things, frankly. I mean, it could be one of a huge ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal as it has. But only yesterday, Thomas Hale wrote for the Financial Times, and the story was headlined, China embraces rail to transport goods to Europe. And the tagline was, manufacturers turn to steel camels in face of shipping container shortages, high costs, and delays. So I think that's also very interesting, because the story talks about increasing volumes of freight being sent across right up to Europe through trains. So I think that's something that's also very interesting with reference to the BRI connectivity.
Absolutely. I mean, it's also better for the world if you're not at the mercy of ships being arbitrarily stuck in important areas, whether it's the Malacca Straits, something bad happening, storms, or the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, and you have land routes which are actually quicker and give you kind of alternatives. That's better for this kind of global supply chain. Otherwise, you could see a series of accidents which would drive, in essence, manufacturers to locate nearer to home. So hopefully this will further the benefits of globalization. I know it's much maligned at this point, but the fact is, the amount of growth for the rest of the world, not Europe and the United States necessarily, although they got 2/3 of the total profits, but the growth for the rest of the world was very good under globalization, and it needs to continue if there's going to be real efforts to erase a lot of these inequalities that exist, especially north-south.
Right. Professor Mitter, if you have any comments with reference to what Einar Tangen has said. And secondly, my question to you is with reference to what I said in the opening also about Manila, saying that there are these Chinese fishing vessels in the Philippines territorial waters. Now, we also know that there is growing tension between Australia and China. As a matter of fact, the Chinese have sanctioned a number of goods that it imports from Australia. So how do we square these tensions in China's backyard with China's broader BRI vision?
Well, I mean, on Tangen's comments, I mean, they seem to me to be, very, very sensible. But I think the one factor that I would just add in again is the question of the pandemic and the post-pandemic world. Iran, the country that's been at the center of what we're talking about, is one of the countries that has suffered particularly badly. Now, I think that it is one of those countries that is beginning to engage with Chinese-provided vaccines, and that's going to provide another point of connection there as well. There are plenty of other countries in the global south that's doing that. But I think we shouldn't underestimate quite how much global trade and global interaction is going to be, in some ways, I think, delayed or held back in a variety of ways that are hard to predict because of the changing and, in some ways, quite lumpy way that COVID is being dealt with around the world. I mean, I believe that right now in Pakistan, Ijaz, you are sitting in the middle of a third wave. Here in Europe, where I am, the UK actually is doing pretty well at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily help us regionally because our neighbors in France and elsewhere and Germany are also having a further wave. China, of course, has managed to control the pandemic pretty successfully, but of course it's done so within highly closed borders, and opening up those borders is going to create a variety of problems there as well. So I think it's what the former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld would have called a known unknown. We simply don't know yet what post-pandemic recovery is going to do to growth. But in answer to the wider set of questions that you're talking about in terms of China's backyard, one of the things we noticed from the National People's Congress, the two sessions that just closed about a week ago, is this big sense of confidence. China is clearly not really very keen, at least in its official elite formation, in listening very much to criticism or comments from others around the world, particularly the United States. I think beneath the surface there is more concern about the relationship actually becoming rather fractious in certain ways, but certainly the rhetoric is one of we are going to, we're big, we're powerful, we have a lot of economic clout, we're going to do what we want. I think the difficulty will come with this. There is a difficulty in terms of the compatibility of being able, as China, to maximize your military and territorial demands, particularly in the ever contentious issue of the South China Sea, where things have been bubbling over for decades now. And while there are occasional sort of small-scale attempts to try and create codes of conduct and other means to try and even out these issues, it's very clear that overall, in the end, China is very determined, I think, to push a maximalist interpretation of its claims. At the moment, I think it's dependent on the fact that China is now the major trading partner for all those countries in the East and Southeast Asia region as a means of holding a sort of economic stick over these other countries. The problem with the Australia example, where they've essentially actually, coerced Australia in certain ways by having such a large share of its trade, is that it's making other actors more wary of becoming too economically dependent on China, or in some cases of trying to restrain the willingness they have in allowing too much Chinese veto over the level of trade that they do. So this is basically a set of judgment calls in Beijing. Do you go for maximalist level of control with confidence that actually you have enough economic and military clout to make it come together? Or do you look for a medium to longer term solution that maybe pulls back a bit from some of those claims, but provides perhaps a more stable long-term solution? No easy answer at the moment. Beijing is quite, as you said, it's just quite an opaque place to try and work out what's going on in terms of policy decisions. The rest of the world is going to be watching with immense interest.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Rana. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Let me go back to Einar Tangen here. Now, Tangen, taking a cue from what Professor Mitter was talking about, and the fact that, the BRI broader vision, wouldn't you agree that it would perhaps be more prudent for Beijing to try and sort out issues in its near abroad, rather than pushing a maximalist position which is likely to redound to the advantage of the United States and its allies?
Yes, I would agree with that. I'm not going to move the government, but it would make sense to use some creativity, especially in the South China Seas issue, and figure out a way in which the area in dispute could become essence the property of all concerned. The issue there would be sharing the resources and things like that. But, in the end, resources that are undeveloped are of no use. And at some point, I think all the nations will realize it's better in their best interest to work together and to not set aside territorial things, but allow each to maintain face, get China's economic muscle and their ability to build things working in terms of, harvesting a lot of the energy assets that are out there. Also, they need to come to terms with this fishing situation. Having 200 boats off of the Philippines is very threatening to the Philippines. I don't think that Beijing wants to make any more enemies or create more angst. So at this point, yes, having some sort of cohesive policy to appear much more reasonable than the U.S. I would pick some minor differences with the professor. I think China is playing the long game. I don't agree that China is opaque at all. It is one of the few governments in the world that is, plods along on 5-year plans. They tell you exactly what they're going to do if you're willing to read the 5-year plan and the adjustments that are made to it each year. I don't think you get that kind of clarity anywhere else in the world, especially democratic countries where, the whole agenda can move based on an election. Somebody fails and somebody new comes in with a completely different set of priorities and maybe even reverse the last ones. So at this point, China has to consider not only its economic interests, but how it wants to engage the world in terms of soft power. And I think I would agree with you, Jazz. This is something that they should be considering very, very carefully.
Right. Now, South China Sea, of course, is a very complex issue. China has another track with the littoral states there. I don't know how that framework is working. I believe some of the meetings haven't taken place. But two other issues that perhaps could be worked more prudently. One is with reference to Xinjiang, and the other is Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong was working fine, and somehow it has, come onto the radar for all the wrong reasons. As far as Xinjiang is concerned, I believe Beijing is in talks with the United Nations for a fact-finding mission. I just want to get your views on these two issues, because if you manage them, you just knock them off the table. And so that basically takes the wind out of the propaganda sails.
Well, unfortunately, Jess, they're all part and parcel of the same issue. China believes that it's under attack in 4 corners: Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and also Taiwan. That these kind of parts of China, which they regard as inalienable parts of China, are being used by outside influences to cause a distraction for China. There's no plans to invade Hong Kong and take it back forcibly, or Xinjiang or Tibet for that matter. And obviously the Taiwan situation is fraught with a number of dangers. But in essence, what Beijing decided to do some years ago was this Sinization. Now, throughout China, you have different languages spoke at almost from city to city. There was one chap who categorized over 5,000, and that was only on the eastern area of China. 5,000 different languages where people would not be able to know exactly what the others were talking about. So China, in order to centralize its country and its progress, said, look, we have to have a unified language. Everybody has to speak it. I know, that doesn't mean that you can't speak your local language, but you must learn, standard Putonghua. So this is what's now happening in both Hong Kong and also in Xinjiang, Tibet as well. If you're part of a country, you need to communicate. For better or worse, China believes that there should be a language, and it's key to economic opportunity. If you don't speak, the major language, you are in essence landlocked wherever you are, and your choices are very limited. They're very interested in promoting this anti-poverty. In order to do that, people have to be able to move, they have to have skills, and they have to have the language. In terms of how you solve these broader issues that you are talking about, this is something where you're not going to see a lot of change. I don't agree that China is trying to be the bully in the China shop here. Excuse the pun. They're really just looking to protect their borders, and how they're going to deal with that is they're going to get things under control, because that's what Beijing does. It's a centralized authority. They want to get things under control, but they're not this arbitrary monster who's running around torturing people and forcing women to have all these hysterectomies and things like this. If they were that way, they wouldn't have bothered with trying to raise people out of poverty, etc.
Right. This is an issue on which we must have another program, but thank you so much. Always a pleasure. That was Einar Tangen speaking with me. Joining me now is Dr. Afzal Ashraf, the Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Nottingham. Dr. Ashraf, thank you for being on the program. Before I wrap up, I just have a quick question with reference to the China-Iran 25-year strategic deal. Now, we know that it's not, at least up until now, it's not transparent. We don't, as a matter of fact, there's been criticism even within Iran with reference to it. So give me your sense of how you look at it.
Consequence of the conditions that have been put in place by the various American administrations, the Trump administration, and now to some degree by the Biden administration. As you are aware, the JCPOA, which was the nuclear agreement that Iran signed with the US and with a number of European countries, including Russia, was unilaterally abrogated by the USA, and as a consequence, the Iranians have had to suffer continuation of certain sanctions, and they are now concerned about their long-term economic future, something which has been accelerated by the COVID crisis. And this deal represents an option for the Iranians and an opportunity for the Chinese. The Chinese want to take advantage of the pressure that Iran is under to negotiate for themselves a very attractive energy package. And in return, of course, Iran wants to be able to get a degree of independence from Western sources for technology and training and other support. So what we're seeing here is, in many ways, a battle between Western diplomacy and emerging Chinese diplomacy. And what we also should acknowledge, and I think very few people appreciate, is that one of the reasons why the West has been a very powerful player in the international stage is that it has had access to technology, or it's a source of technology that most countries can't get from any other source. And what we're now seeing is what I would describe as a democratization of technology, where China and indeed other countries, but China particularly, is able to match and sometimes in some cases exceed the technological advancement of the West. So what we're seeing is a change in the sort of political and economic map of the world, giving countries such as Iran and other countries that aren't aligned or being excluded from the Western sphere of influence other options. And the Chinese are in themselves playing a very smart game. They are simultaneously negotiating with Iran's, if you like, opponents, the Saudis and the UAE, for example. The Chinese have visited those countries, the Chinese leadership has visited those countries and come to some form of economic agreements. I think a lot of people don't realize, for example, China is providing vaccines to the UAE and earning a huge amount of money in the process, as well as considerable risk.
Absolutely. That's part of China's broader diplomacy. Thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf. I'm sorry I've run out of time, but it's interesting to hear your thoughts on this. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the negative coverage India is getting across the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Stories coming out of India, for the most part, remain negative. From Freedom House's downgrading of India from free to partly free, to CNN's documentary on bonded labor, to a bitterly contested election in West Bengal with allegations being traded between the BJP and All India Trinamool Congress, to farmers' protests, to India getting into diplomatic spats with other states like Canada and the UK, to top intellectuals resigning from Ashoka University, India seems to be moving away under the BJP from the basic principles of its constitution and the vision of its founding fathers. To discuss what's happening, I am joined by Samir Pasha, who specializes in human rights and international law, and Nishant Verma, a political and economic affairs commentator. Mr. Verma, we have talked about these things before also on this program, but give me your sense of how you look at this as someone who believes in the Indian Constitution and inclusiveness.
Oh, well, if you're talking about the bonded labor and the slavery part of it, this is not something which has come in yesterday. The world is gripped due to bonded labor and slavery ever since time immemorial. The larger portion is that when we look at the countries, especially in Asia, those countries which are primarily into agriculture or industries, this is not something new. The issue has been there since ages. I do have the figures from United.
But wasn't it banned in 1976? I believe I have the year right. Legally speaking, bonded labor was banned in 1976. Is that right?
Right. You're absolutely right. In 1976, bonded labor was banned in India, no doubt about it. And ever since, not only India, but the world has been working in terms of eradicating bonded labor from this world. And I want to give you some data fact. United Nations in 2018 came up with the data in order to project what is the situation of bonded labor and slavery in this world. 40 million people were bonded labor in the year 2018 as per United Nations, out of which 25 million exactly as bonded labor and about 15 million in human trafficking such as prostitution and so on. The highest rate United Nations said per capita was in somewhere in Asia like North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, Cambodia. Whereas in terms of numbers, the highest definitely was India with about 8 million, China with 3.86 million, Pakistan 3.2 million, and North Korea with about approximately 3 million bonded labor. Now, why does this happen? Anywhere where you see the traits of industrial business or agriculture or dictatorship, bonded labor has been there and is required to be eradicated. I'll give you one small comparison. This wonderful comparison is of something common between Indians and Pakistanis when we go and work in United States under H-1B visa. Is equivalent to bonded labor of sorts when you talk about Singapore multi-story slums where people have been brought into work, is equivalent to people working from our countries in GCC countries. These are different panoramas, but the pointer is, could it be agriculture, could it be industries? This old trait of bonded labor has continued. What needs to be done, what is being done by all the countries. It's not only about India. Yes, India is a very large population, and yes, India has around 8 million plus bonded labor as per the United Nations. This is decreasing day by day. What is happening in Karnataka is not only in Karnataka, it is a global issue.
Right. Barrister Pasha, let me pull you in on this. Since we started talking about bonded labor, give me your sense of, obviously, Mr. Verma is quoting the UN figures, and there is a global problem. But give me your sense of how you look at this.
Right. So the first thing to realize is that international law mainly works on self-reporting and self-adherence by states. India is no exception to that. So most countries who work within the international framework have adhered and ratified treaties and conventions for a number of decades. India is no exception. The problem is it's based on this voluntary application of what you have agreed on an international basis to impose and implement on the ground in your own country. Now, the biggest problem is governance and accountability. These two things are very hard to come by in countries in South Asia, especially. And when it comes to application of international law, it's very few and far between. And one example I will give you is the fact that India is part of and has ratified the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which under Article 8 bans and prohibits the use of slavery or any form of slavery. And indentured labor or debt bondage is a type of slavery, which has been accepted. There's no issue with that. What is the issue is the fact that there is absolutely no accountability of it. So the only thing that India and any other signatory to the ICCPR has to do is basically send in a report to the Human Rights Committee in the UN once every 4 years to give them an update and status on how they're doing on this. There's no actual accountability and there's not much governance direction from the top as to how do we actually eradicate and prohibit this. There is, I should mention, that there is an optional protocol that some countries can sign up to, where an individual in the country can make a complaint to the UN through an individual complaints mechanism. And there is an optional protocol for slavery and for types of slavery. India, unfortunately, is not a signatory to that. So the only actual international legal obligation that India has to perform is once every 4 years, send in a report to the UN Human Rights Committee. And that, in a nutshell, is the issue with accountability and governance when you look at India or indeed any other signatory country in terms of implementing international law.
Right. Thank you. This is all from In Focus. Tonight, we shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Also, given the third COVID-19 wave, both in Pakistan and across the world, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.